So we've seen 1, 2, 3 live-action versions of the Amazing Spider-Man on the big screen, and also one animated version on top of that. And that's all in the span of the last 18 years alone. So given the fact that Robert Downey Jr. has been playing Iron Man for over 10 years, that's pretty fast turnover for the webheads. Needless to say, there is a wide array of opinions out there when it comes to which iteration of Spider-Man is the best. But there is one pattern that you tend to see, especially among videos like this one. MCU Spider-Man is bad. You know, you have the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, which was the first one on the silver screen, very popular back then, and many still love him today. You have the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, who was hated in his time, but not unlike the Star Wars prequels, years later people have begun to appreciate him. And then you have Tom Holland Spider-Man, the current iteration of the character, who's also part of the biggest movie franchise in the history of the planet. Now, if you're a follower of the channel, you know that I love Spider-Man. Spider-Man is my favorite comic book character.
Oh yeah.
You also know that I have a bit of a soft spot for the MCU, so it probably doesn't shock you that I unapologetically love MCU Spider-Man. So consider this video me officially putting my foot down. I'm tired of seeing my boy Tommy dragged through the mud time and time again. I think the day of reckoning has finally come. But don't get it twisted. The thesis of this video is not MCU Spider-Man is the best Spider-Man. I have unconditional love for all 3 of these Spider-Men. The thesis of this video is MCU Spider-Man : better than you think. And also, this isn't going to be some filibuster on comic book accuracy or anything like that. It's not like I've read every Spider-Man comic ever, and even if I had, the character tends to change a bit depending on who's writing him, just like the movie versions do. Not to mention, comic book accuracy doesn't necessarily make for a better movie anyway. It can be nice to have as a novelty, but at the end of the day, it's just not that important to the story, in my opinion, anyway. This video is simply going to break down what makes this Spider-Man amazing, and we're also going to address some of the biggest complaints that I hear against this Spider-Man as we go, because I do hear a lot of the same stuff floating around out there, and I feel like there is a gross lack of counter arguments being talked about. With all that being said, let's get started. I've condensed everything that I want to talk about today into 4 main points, and remember that this is what I love about MCU Spider-Man specifically, so not the character in general. And as I talk about these points, we'll do a couple of sidebars to talk about the common complaints that I just mentioned a second ago. Number 1.
Nice job, kid.
Thanks. Well, I could have stuck the landing a little better. It's just a new suit.
So the first thing that I love about MCU Spider-Man is so painfully obvious that I feel stupid saying it, but I have to nonetheless. This Spider-Man exists within the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I know that it's a popular opinion to think that being in the MCU instantly bogs down any character, as the Disney overlords are sure to make everything as heartless as possible. But let's consider a couple things. Because of his place in the MCU, the world doesn't revolve around this Spider-Man. In fact, up until this point, he hasn't been very important to the central story of the MCU. And I love that fact. Have you ever heard the phrase,
Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
is there any Spider-Man that is a friendlier neighbor than this one? I mean, just think about it. While he's doing backflips for random citizens, Andrew is over here trying to stop the population of New York from being turned into giant lizards. In other words, the weight of the universe doesn't rest on this Spider-Man's shoulders because he exists in a world where he's not the only hero. Also, I want you to think about the unique relationships the MCU allows Peter to have. Yeah, we have these fun ones.
I'm Peter, by the way.
Doctor Strange.
Oh, you're using your made-up names. I'm Spider-Man then.
But one of my favorite things about this Spider-Man is his relationship with Tony Stark, which we're gonna get more into in just a second. But being in the MCU expands Spidey's horizon, and it also allows him to actually act as a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Would the world end if this Peter decided to stop being Spider-Man? Probably not. At least, not for now. Thus far, we've kind of seen Peter in his training wheels stage, which I have really enjoyed. But I will say that after Far From Home, it seems like he'll be taking a more central role in world-saving operations. But the point remains. Thus far, we've seen him as a small-time, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. And I love the fact that even though there are other heroes, Peter still feels obligated to use his powers to help others.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
Moving on to my second major point of defense.
So you've done there's in trouble. What's your plan? Go.
Okay. Did you ever see this really old movie, Aliens?
So let's circle back to that guy that I mentioned earlier, Tony Stark. One of the biggest complaints I hear about this Spidey is, where was Uncle Ben? The first time that we see Peter in the MCU, Uncle Ben is already dead. Whereas with the other two, we see how they interact with Uncle Ben, and we see what kind of eventual impact his death has on them. So naturally, people complain that we didn't get to see that with MCU Spider-Man. But let me hit you with a mind grenade here. Tony Stark is his Uncle Ben. I mean, he checks all of the boxes. Father figure, check. Mentor, check. Gives a life-changing piece of advice to Peter, check. And, oh yeah, he dies, leaving Peter heartbroken and determined to make him proud. Only, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say something that I know was gonna make some people mad. Tony does it better than the other Uncle Bens, and here's why. With the other Bens, we don't really see them too much or even learn that much about them. Basically, all we see is that they're good men, we see that they love Peter, they say the line, and then they kick the bucket before the second act. We never really know them outside of a Peter context. In the case of Tony, we got 3 movies detailing his journey from selfish douchebag to responsible adult, and that's all before he even met Peter. So he already has this massive head start on the other Uncle Bens because the audience knows him so well. We've seen him learn, we've seen him grow, we've seen him at his highs and his lows. And on top of that, we also have 3 more movies that build the relationship between Tony and Peter before Tony's death. Now, granted, their relationship is just a small chunk of those 3 movies, but you still get to see it evolve and change over time.
Like someone will call you.
Oh,
All right?
from your team.
Okay. That's not a hug. I'm just grabbing the door for you. We're not there yet.
And then he started doing the yellow sparkly thing that he does all the time. What are you doing? Oh, this is nice.
Could you imagine if we got an Uncle Ben trilogy showing his life before he raised Peter Parker? I mean, I'm not saying that I would even want that, but it would be cool to get some more depth on the character like we have with Tony, and that could add a lot to the relationship. To really drive this point home, I want you to consider this moment, which is one of my favorites in the MCU, by the way.
Okay, it's not working out. I'm gonna need the suit back.
For how long?
Forever. Yeah, that's
No,
how it
no, no,
works.
please, Mr.
Let's
Stark,
have it.
you don't understand.
This is all I have. I'm nothing without this suit.
If you're nothing without this suit, then you shouldn't have it, okay?
This is more or less this Peter's version of the great power, great responsibility talk. But the difference here is that we've seen Tony learn the lesson that he's trying to teach Peter. As a matter of fact, Iron Man 3 is an entire movie dedicated to teaching Tony this principle when he loses the Iron Man suit and has to solve his problems using his intellect. Don't get me wrong, I really love this scene from the original Spider-Man.
With great power comes great responsibility.
But what power was Uncle Ben referring to here? As far as he's concerned, Peter is just a normal high school kid, a nerd even. This feels more like a shot in the dark that just so happens to be wildly applicable to Peter than it does relevant advice. Whereas when Tony says the line, you know he understands what Peter's going through, and you know that he knows what he's talking about. So for me, it just hits a little bit harder. And while we're on the topic of Tony Stark, now seems like a good time to address this criticism. MCU Spider-Man is just Iron Man Jr. The argument here is that Tony Stark has been too important to Peter Parker in the MCU, that Peter's character relies too much on Tony's, and that he isn't his own man. Now, there's no denying that Tony Stark's shadow looms heavy over Spider-Man Homecoming and Far From Home. But personally, I think that this is really overplayed. I mean, for sure Tony has a strong effect on Peter's story, but here's the deal. Peter is just an average person in the MCU. He is, as people often refer to Spider-Man, the everyman. He's not a god, not a billionaire, not from another planet. He's a high schooler. And through the 2 Spider-Man movies that we have in the MCU, we actually get a unique look into the MCU world from the perspective of the everyman. And I love that. So yes, Tony's influential to Peter's story, but it makes sense within the context of the world. And I don't think that stops Peter from being his own character. As a matter of fact, I think that's shown pretty well actually in Spider-Man Homecoming. About halfway through the movie, Peter gets into a sticky situation and Iron Man has to come bail him out, at which point he scolds Peter and takes his suit. At the end of the movie, Peter can't resist the call to stop bad things from happening. But this time, when he gets into another sticky situation, Iron Man is not there to help him. He's forced to figure it out for himself. He's forced to grow independent of Tony, and he rises to the occasion. This idea is hit even harder at the very end when Tony offers Peter a spot on the Avengers, but but Peter declines. So although their relationship is very important to Peter's story, Peter is still in fact Peter Parker. Also, I know a lot of people don't like the fact that this Peter suit was made by Tony, and to that I would say at least this gives Peter an excuse to have these high-tech emoting eyes on his mask, which I think were a fantastic addition to the character. Also, I always had a hard time believing that these other guys just made their suits. I mean, I can buy the fact that they have superhuman strength, but I draw the line at you telling me that this guy can sew a suit that looks this good. All right, so moving along, let's talk about the next thing that I love about this Spidey.
Peter, have fun, okay?
I will.
One of the more defining characteristics of Spider-Man for me is that he's younger than the other guys, more of a kid. I think that's part of what makes him so relatable, and I think that the MCU Spider-Man captures his youth in a near perfect way. For example, let's look at this.
Join me and together we'll build my new Lego Death Star.
What?
So lame.
No way, that's awesome. How many pieces?
3,803.
Now, can you look me in the eyes and tell me that you could see either of these other guys go home after school and build a Lego Death Star? Probably not. And that just goes to show how differently you look at the other two. They just seem so much older and so much more mature. To be fair, this isn't objectively a bad thing, but I do think it takes away from the fun that is Spider-Man. It's what separates him from heroes like Iron Man or Captain America. He's a teenager, and although he feels great responsibility, he still has teenager tendencies. He feels like he needs to be saving the world, but he also wants to go to prom, like most kids do. It also helps that Tom Holland is the youngest actor to play Peter Parker, and that he was also surrounded by other younger actors to play his classmates as well. And all of that actually really segues nicely into the next point, which is actually more about the movies in general than just the character.
Students, don't forget about your homecoming tickets. Do you have a date for homecoming?
Thanks, Jason, but I already have a date.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I may get torn apart for this, but I love how the MCU Spider-Man movies have a lighter, more high school-y tone than the other two. I just said a second ago that Spidey's youth is a part of what separates him from the other superheroes. Well, likewise, the tone of these movies are part of what separates them from other superhero movies. And before you head to the comments complaining about how I don't want a deeper, more emotional Spider-Man story, that's not true at all. It's been pointed out in plenty of video essays how much heart and emotion the Raimi Spider-Man movies had, and I completely agree with that. I think those movies struck a great balance of a lighter, more campy tone along with deep emotions. The odd man out here is really the Amazing Spider-Man movies, which were going for more of a Nolan Batman tone that I just don't think works that well for Spider-Man. I mean, I don't want to see Spider-Man brooding all the time. We have Batman for that. But like the Raimi movies, I feel like MCU Spider-Man does have a more fun, more light tone. And I want to clear this up. Just because a movie is fun doesn't mean that it can't be serious or emotional at times. I know that Homecoming and Far From Home aren't perfect in this department, but I think that the good far outweighs the bad. And overall, I'm glad that they didn't go for a darker tone with this Spider-Man. I mean, it's not freaking 13 Reasons Why. It's okay to have some fun with the high school setting. But yes, it is important to have moments of real drama. And I think the emotional climaxes of both Homecoming and Far From Home really scratched that itch for me. One final note to end on, this is the third version of Spider-Man that we've seen. If you've watched this far and you're still not sold on MCU Spidey, then maybe you can at least agree that it's nice that they tried to shake things up for the character. If you hate the fact that we didn't see Uncle Ben or that Tony Stark is his mentor, or whatever it may be, at least they tried something new, and I'd prefer that to a carbon copy of what we've already seen. A quick reminder that I do in fact love all three of these guys. Spider-Man is such a captivating and relatable character. I mean, there's a reason that after all these years, he's still relevant, and I think he'll be relevant for many years to come. There are things that I love about all three versions of the character, but for me, MCU Spider-Man has captured all of my favorite aspects of the character almost perfectly. He's just a kid living in a crazy world who feels obligated to help people with this gift that he never asked for. Sometimes he doesn't know how to help, and sometimes he makes mistakes. He wants to do kid stuff like hang out with his best friend and build Legos or chase after the prettiest girl in his class. He can be awkward and nerdy, but when push comes to shove, there's no sacrifice that he won't make for the greater good. He puts it on the line, and when he puts on that mask, he is Spider-Man. So that wraps it up for my defense of MCU Spider-Man. Let me know what you think of this version of the character down below. As always, you can like this video if you enjoyed it. You can subscribe to the channel for more videos, and you can follow me on Twitter for any channel updates. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.